BrownBag Luncheon. I'm Adam Thompson, the Assistant Director of the Kutak Ethics Center at the College of Law. We hold these every month during the regular fall, spring semesters. Typically, we provide lunch. This time around, obviously we can't. But nevertheless, should still be a fun, enriching experience. And I'm just really happy to have, so much participation, even during, such a really, really tough semester. So thank you very much. Our topic for today is quilts, migration, and human rights. And our panelists are all, I believe our panel is completely made up of individuals who brought Hostile Terrain 94 to Nebraska, or at least to our campus. And it's wrapping up now, as I was just told. So we're on sort of the last major event for them. This is also in conjunction with the Women's Center, Week Without Violence. That was probably a couple of weeks ago, but that's all right. It's always good to celebrate no violence. So with that said, I'm gonna pass it to Jonathan Gregory. He's gonna give a sort of introduction to the panel and project, and I'll follow up with some questions, and of course, we're always happy to take questions from the audience. So, Gregory, or Jonathan, sorry. Oh, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
Okay, well, I was just rehearsing to myself there. Hi, I'm Jonathan Gregory. I'm the Assistant Curator of Exhibitions at the International Quilt Museum at the University of Nebraska. We're on the East Campus. I'm one of the organizing team for Hostile Terrain 94, and I'd like the rest of the panel members to introduce themselves briefly, and we'll start with Claire.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Nicholas. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Textiles, Merchandising, and Fashion Design. I'm actually a cultural anthropologist by training. And I am one of the kind of, I guess, lead organizers for planning and executing the exhibition, as well as some of the programming that's gone along with it. So I'm very excited to be here.
Effie?
Hi, everybody. I'm Effie Athanasopoulos. I'm an associate professor in anthropology and classics, and anthropology now is part of the School of Global Integrative Studies. And I have worked from the beginning with Claire and Jonathan and our larger organizing team to bring all this to Nebraska, to UNL, and it has been a really rewarding experience. So I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to our discussion.
Yes, thank you. And Courtney, and then Adria.
Hello, I'm Courtney Hellebreck, and I am the Samuel Clark Waugh Professor of International Relations and an Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. I'm also the Director of the Forsyth Family Program on Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, and it's in that capacity that I was able to collaborate with Claire and Effie and Jonathan on this Hostile Terrain exhibit. And it was a real distinct honor to be able to work with them to bring this impactful programming to campus. And thanks, Adam, for having us all today. We're excited to chat with you and your group.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm Adria Sanchez-Chidas. I'm a graduate student in textiles, merchandising, and fashion design. I've just been assisting on the project where necessary, hands on deck, and I've also helped to run all the social media channels for the project as well.
Right. Yes, thank you. what I'd like to do now is to share my screen and just give you a little bit of an introduction to the hostile terrain exhibit as some background for our panel discussion today. And okay, hopefully you are seeing my screen. Hostile Terrain 94 at Nebraska is it is part of a larger project called Hostile Terrain 94 that is part of it's put together by the Undocumented Migration Project, and I'll go through a little bit more about them in a moment. The name derives from a 1994 US border protection policy called Prevention Through Deterrence, which its aim was to reduce immigration through the urban crossing points along the US-Mexico border. And I think also the northern border, but more relevant to this discussion is the southern border. Making it necessary for those who wish to still cross and not go through the urban crossings to go through less hospitable areas. And in the policy, those areas were called hostile terrain. There was an acknowledgement in the policy that mortality numbers would increase as a result of this policy if people did intend to cross, though they felt that the policy would sufficiently deter crossing in the hope that that would not happen. So this was 1994. In the years since then, the number of deaths along the border has gone up significantly, and particularly in the region that's called the Tucson sector, which encompasses most of the US border with Mexico in the state of Arizona. Since 1994, or since the mid-90s through 2019, there have been about 3,200 deaths. This is counted by the human remains that have been discovered in the Sonoran Desert and have been taken to the Office of the Medical Examiners in Tucson, and some also in Phoenix. At the University of Nebraska, the Hostile Terrain exhibition has taken the form of a quilt. And here you see it installed at the crib in the City Union, which was the first place it was installed. It is composed of, in our case, a grid of white cloth squares that correspond to a grid that allowed us to geolocate the places of death or places where the remains were discovered onto this map. The rest of the map is simply a borderline, particularly of the, primarily of the state of Arizona with Mexico, and Phoenix, Tucson, and the city of Nogales, a border city, which is obscured by the tags. You'll see two colors of tags here. They are tan and orange. The tan tags, which is about 2/3 of them, represent those remains which were identified with a name, and the orange are those who were unidentified. And on each tag, there are various details about gender, sex, age, a place of where the remains were found, who was responsible for that area, whether it was private or public land or something else, and then the cause of death and the condition of the remains. Here, just a little bit of detail of what you might see if you haven't had the opportunity to see the exhibition yet. This was a participatory art exhibit. So at Nebraska, more than 300 individuals have participated in filling out these toe tags by transferring information that came directly from the coroner's offices in these Arizona cities and transferring it to these tags. And then another host of volunteers who pinned these to the quilted exhibition. As I mentioned, Hostel Train 94 is a project of the Undocumented Migration Project, which was founded by Jason De Leon, an anthropologist at the University of California in Los Angeles, and also a MacArthur Fellow. And let's see, we have a host of sponsors for this exhibition that we're happy to acknowledge here. And I wish I had time to read all of them, but they have provided a large amount of support for the exhibition and our programming. And we've had an organizing committee. Again, I won't read all their names. And let's see. This was actually from a previous presentation, but it is fair and important for us to acknowledge that we are today gathered on lands that at one time are the past, present, and future homelands of Pawnee, Ponca, Oto, Missouriana, Omaha, Dakota, Lakota, Kaw, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, as well as those of the relocated Ho-Chunk, Sac and Fox, and Iowa peoples. It's important to acknowledge this because we may be talking about migration at the southern US border, but we also live in a place where peoples have inhabited this land for thousands of years and have been displaced and migrated for many numbers of reasons. We want to acknowledge those who lived here before us. I hope I have given you a good overview of this project, and Adam, I will turn it back to you. And Adam, you are muted.
Excellent. Yeah, sorry. That was excellent. Thank you very much. So I'll ask some questions that I prepared and that the panel has seen. I'll pause maybe between each question to see if the audience has a follow-up or maybe a more interesting question than my next one was going to be. And so that, knowing that if you see time running out and there was a question you wanted to get to a panelist, go ahead and say, hey, can we just talk about this thing that we haven't gotten to talk about yet? Well, if that's all right, then that'll work. Okay, so first question for panel, and please feel free, all of you can answer, of course. How do you understand the concept and implementation of the whole installation project?
I can give one version of an answer. I mean, Jonathan said this in his description of how the kind of tags were filled out, but I think that in hearing Jason De Leon speak about the development of the project, he described this process of coming to the realization that the exhibition itself would have more impact and reach a broader range of people, but also connect them to the project in a more personal and visceral way by having it grounded in participation and specifically in the act of kind of witnessing and honoring or memorializing the individuals kind of represented on the tags. And so I think that comes out of his gradual kind of entry into the political art worlds from anthropology. And so he's spoken about initially being uncomfortable or reticent to, as a four-field kind of trained anthropologist. So he does forensic anthropology, archaeology, ethnography or cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology. That was his original kind of wheelhouse. And it took some time and some previous iterations of similar kinds of exhibitions to get to the point of having created Hostile Terrain 94. But I think that he thought, and there was a better opportunity for the research and the insights of anthropology to be to reach a broader audience through this kind of format, but also through the participatory aspect of it.
I can follow up on that and say, you know, oftentimes in academia we talk about the value of interdisciplinarity, but we don't often, or we don't as frequently act upon it as we do talk about it. And I think one of the things that really struck me about this project, and particularly the implementation of the different stages, both of the physical act of writing the toe tags and then those that participated in hanging it, but also the speakers, the lectures, it really, I think, reinforced the idea of interdisciplinarity as an academic exercise, but also stressed the multidimensional nature of the problem itself. So it was really interesting across the course of events to think about this problem, which I, as a human rights scholar, think about from a very political and legal perspective, from a much more tactile or anthropological or sociological perspective. And so I think we actually had an opportunity to take this value of interdisciplinarity, employ it to make this project happen, but then also use it to reflect on the multi-dimensions of the migration crisis at the border itself.
And I wanted to add that for me, it was a deeply moving, powerful project from the very beginning. And one of those aspects is its scholarly aspect, which is a really data-heavy project. And, you know, it comes across when you become involved in this project, how data heavy it is. And these data, which were generated by, you know, the medical examiner's office, by the Undocumented Migration Project, they have become the means to really mobilize public opinion. So that's what I find powerful about it. And for me, the installation makes aspects of the intangible tangible. So it's something that you can touch, you can experience, you can participate, and that's what makes it powerful. And I mean, it is the visualization of the data, which is really its distinct signature, because it blends ethnography, archaeology, visual anthropology, forensic science, and it does it in a very simple way to achieve certain goals. So that's what I really like about this exhibition.
I might add just a bit in that the use of names in the exhibition, in taking something as a very large topic of immigration to the United States from Latin America, and putting it in individual human terms by looking at individual names, or those who are unnamed and become unnamed because of these policies and the environment and just all the factors that are at work here. And it's something that we as a culture have come to value more so in recent times. We think of the Vietnam Memorial Wall, which is a wall of names and memorials to previous times of war that US has participated in, have been more symbolic in looking at the sort of the ideals that were surrounding our participation. If we look at the AIDS Memorial Quilt, its power, much of its power is in the use of individual names and the depiction of things about that individual's life that humanized the epidemic, the AIDS epidemic, and did indeed cause there to be action and response.
I think really quickly I'll add to, just from a student perspective too, I think the the interdisciplinary nature of this project was one of my probably favorite things about it. You know, I'm from Southern California and I'm Latina myself, so immigration is definitely a topic that is kind of near and dear to me, that, you know, I think about a lot, and that is something that I kind of see swept under the rug a lot. And so having this kind of project on this level, this magnitude across the university, it's really powerful to see like so many disciplines come together to kind of address and talk about this very big issue in a way that I think is powerful, and that like anyone can kind of see this quilt, see how many names are up there, and kind of understand the magnitude of the issue. So yeah, that's one thing that I've really appreciated about the project.
Any questions from the audience?
I actually have a question, and it might be a question for Claire. I'm not entirely sure, but so having participated as a faculty member in like the workshops and pinning, I really got to see kind of the behind the scenes, the level. I mean, somebody mentioned the data heavy, the amount of work that was required to put something on like this. I kind of wonder if you ever question like, oh my God, what did I get myself into, you know, and how you feel about that now, just to put it out there.
We can probably all speak to this in different ways, but yes, I mean, I think your question also connects with the issue of the pandemic and doing the project in the midst of a pandemic, which, I mean, even without that added complication, it had, you know, it went from a single installation site, which is how the project is being done in most other places that we're aware of, to let's make this a mobile traveling exhibition. We can have it appear in multiple sites. So the sequencing is extended. The logistics of that has to be taken into consideration. Suddenly you're, you know, in discussions with multiple hosts. And so that had already kind of expanded maybe beyond an original concept. And then when the pandemic occurred or was occurring, we had to pivot, you know, and make a decision about whether we wanted to continue as planned or adjust. And so the planning that went into executing or running all of the witnessing and remembrance workshops, that was really very challenging, the logistics of it and making sure people are safe. And you know, it's a hybrid in the sense that we had the physical tags were always part of that, those workshops, regardless of if they were held via Zoom or outside, socially distanced. But that ended up being very, very difficult to coordinate. So yeah, the labor that went into that was enormous, not just, you know, with all of us put in that kind of labor. So yeah, I think there were definitely moments where I was worried that we would have to be, you know, pinning while it was installed somewhere, you know, that was a concern. And but we had a lot of plan B, plan C and contingencies, and lots of people stepped up. And I think in the end, you know, it was so worth it. But yes, that's my impression.
And I wanted to say that I remember discussions especially with Claire, saying, well, we may not have enough toe tags filled for the exhibition, and we may need, you know, to do filling in of tags as the exhibition is in various places. Well, that was one scenario, but it never happened, because at the end, you know, we could have used more tags. We could have really organized several more witnessing and remembrance sessions, and they were a great way to really raise public awareness about the issues. Many people that participated did not know that this was going on. And, this was really a powerful way to be introduced into it. I mean, it's something very immediate. It's immersive. When you start writing the information from a simple database to this toe tag, it gets transformed. It gets transformed to a person. And you are emotionally connected, with the last minutes of the life of that person. So I think that is really the very simple but powerful aspect that is built into this participatory exhibition.
One of the things that we, I guess the pearl that came from being in a pandemic and deciding to move forward when many of the other hosts and creators of this exhibition around the world have decided to delay till 2021, is we realized that for the impact, for us to have the impact that we had hoped for, we needed to find another way to take it to people. And so we were able to secure funding from Humanities Nebraska. And second source of funding for the video is, I can't recall.
College of Arts and Sciences Idea
Yes.
Committee, and
Okay.
also the Office of Diversity and Inclusion.
Yes, thank you, Claire. So we are working on a video that will be accompanied by lesson plans, and that will then be available, in perpetuity, potentially, for this exhibition to have an ongoing impact. Particularly, it's targeted towards high school students, and we'll try to get it out here in the state of Nebraska, first of all.
Great. Yeah, I was going to say, thank you very much for including my name on the list of people who were a part of the project, but honestly, I couldn't get anyone to do the hosting for the things that I thought I could. So I don't want to take any of the credit. You all did something pretty spectacular. I was kind of more in the background trying to, can we at least have a panel discussion at some point? Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful. In relation to sort of the direction Claire took the first question, part of my research, a big part of my research is just trying to figure out how to teach philosophy. It's, one thing that's always bothered me about graduate school, at least for philosophers in the United States, is a real lack of training on how to get information across to people, how to not just have them learn it so they can repeat it, but take something with them that 5 years, 10 years down the road, they can really think, that really put me in a place to grasp something that I needed to grasp. That's still helping me now. And a lot of that education is what a lot of people refer to as immersive education. And I think Effie did sort of mention that. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. It seems like this is exactly the kind of project that's likely to engender the sort of feelings and thoughts that tend to lead to shifts in attitudes and behaviors for the positive. I'm just wondering if you could speak to that or say more about that.
So I can start maybe, Adam. So as a political scientist, and maybe I'm guessing this is perhaps different than what happens in your classrooms and in your research, Claire, Effie, and Jonathan, but I use no materials, right? So typically I'm a political scientist. I lecture in my human rights class, which my students sometimes tell me should be called Killing Hopes and Dreams. I will stand there and tell them that 3,200 people died between these years crossing the Sonora Desert. But it's the ability to put them into these immersive experiences and actually have them do the work that I think not only reinforces the message, but also leaves them feeling more empowered, right? Because they were part of a project and they were part of a community tackling this issue. So even though they weren't doing any sort of active policy change through the act of writing these toe tags, A, I think it felt much more real to them and far less abstract. And B, I think it left them feeling like there's actually something that they could do, right, in order to address some of these issues. So that part for me and for my students, I think was really transformative. They were doing something actively, tactilely, that they wouldn't normally do within the confines of a political science or international law class.
I
Great.
would,
Yeah. Great.
I agree
Yeah.
with that.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was, and I don't have like a ton to add to that, but I do think that that was something that we were, or we at least talked about, what outcomes, you know, are hoped for with this kind of an exhibition. And I do think, and maybe we can get into this later too, but the wanting to keep the outcome be focused on action or on empowering viewers or participants to, at the very least, become informed or seek out information based on, I mean, not everything, you can't capture the complexity of migration policies and impacts and forces and things like that with a single exhibition, but there are some breadcrumb trails that kind of lead out from the exhibition. And I think that that first step of engagement and immersion is a very effective way to then have it lead out to these other modes of action instead of a passive kind of receiving it as a spectacle, but actually what do we do next was the kind of hope anyways for the outcome.
And I was very interested in how the organizer, you know, Jason DeLeon, who really conceived of this project, how he came to this design. And he explains that pretty well in several of his talks, his lectures. And here's a quote, and I think it's worth reading it because he describes the evolution which really led to this effective design. So he says in the first prototype, we took GIS data and made a giant sticker graphic using red dots to show migrant death. That visualization where the red dots represented a person just didn't have the impact. So in the second version, we swapped out the dots for the handwritten toe tags. Students did the handwriting. They shared that it was emotionally difficult for them. I wanted to put names to the dead. This is an act of witnessing. The data come from a Microsoft database. We're asking volunteers to breathe life into the data by writing out the details. That was the closest way we could think of to get someone to feel the human cost. I've filled out hundreds of toe tags. It doesn't get any easier. So I think that really says it very well. Exactly how sort of an abstract discussion about the cost, the migrant lives, the cost of my immigration policies, how it can be translated to something that becomes, again, very immediate. You become immersed in it, and then you're more prone to act. You're more prone to, you know, take actions that you wouldn't otherwise, you know, to bring some positive change.
From the perspective of like Adam, in your question, speaking of non-text centered materials, and just like they are, where you're dealing with material objects, these tags, this exhibition, it's all stuff, and like everything, stuff has meaning. Like we give it meaning culturally, socially. Just, you know, my sweater might mean something to me because of where it came from and who gave it to me or how long I had to save for it, you know, if it's one of those expensive pieces of clothing. But we somehow, it's like material objects are intersections of so many things that create the context in which that material object was created and used and transmitted maybe to someone else. And each layer of that strata adds meaning to those objects. And so we draw upon our experience with objects that are similar. For example, if we just pick quilts, because that's the thing I know the most about, quilts, if I was to ask any of you, what does a quilt mean? Or what do you think of when you think of a quilt? I'm going to hear things about maybe a family member, probably a female who maybe makes them or gave you one, or you have some concept of their role in people's lives. But quilts, intersecting in quilts are the social status of the person who made the piece, their material means, the technologies that went into creating a fabric, what was the discourse at the time. If there's text on there, like it has political text, which often we find in quilts in the 19th century. Those are all things that mediate to us the context of where that piece came. And so then the person who interacts with it is then able to go into that context, to have access to those contexts. So with this exhibition, the tags, the information that's there, but the information that's not there is also part of the impact with the material. I don't know if I have much more to say about it, but I've just been so struck in working with material objects and studying them at how much they mediate things that are, they mediate things to us that are on the affective level as well as the cognitive. And I think that's the sort of engagement that we all need in order to, like, for something to change within us, or to help others to consider something and change, that they access that at both a cognitive and an affective level.
I'll just quickly add to kind of to one of Jonathan's points there. The idea that like what's not there is also a part of this exhibition. Like there's been points where, we were working on actually, pinning everything to the quilt, and we had some like outside volunteers, like from sororities and other groups that came to help. And not all of them had participated in the actual writing of the toe tags, but as they were working on pinning, they, would take the time to read each one and like kind of reflect on the, like, what was their story, like how did they get there, what happened to them. And it was really interesting that there, we have such limited information, but they were so compelled about like the background of each individual person. So like what was not there was this person's story, but it was still like reflected on in like a really impactful way.
I think.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, to pick up on Adria's comment, I think one thing that was also really impactful, both in the process of writing out the toe tags, but then also when you see them all together, is again, the absence sometimes of those names. So as Jonathan mentioned, about 1/3, is that right? A third of the tags have no names with them. And I actually, from my own experience writing out the toe tags, and then from what some people in the group that we organized also shared, those tags without a name juxtaposed with those that do have a name sort of further piqued both empathy and curiosity about who this person was behind really what skeletal remains were left. So again, the absences, I think, speak just as loudly as what we did know.
Yeah, just to add one thing, it sparks the imagination. It engages the imagination to fill in the blanks. The imagination starts bringing up questions for, well, what is not here, what is missing, or how do these things make sense together? And then we could begin to potentially reconstruct a narrative that is is likely, and then that helps us then to imagine what is my response to be. If this is what is actually true, then what should I do?
Yeah, as you all were saying that, I sort of thought about a topic that is part of the next question, but it's fairly risky then, trying to figure out how to represent such a significant, very serious moment or event, or just period of time. There's just lots of pain, suffering, etc., that you're trying to bring to light, to educate folks, and you don't want any sort of voyeurism to take place, or just you don't want an interaction with it that's going to lessen the seriousness of it, or maybe say the wrong message or whatnot. So I'm wondering if you could say a bit about the ethics of representing violence, pain, suffering, regardless of the medium. But in particular, quilts, if you wanted to.
I would like to, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to say something, as I just edited the chat. This is very important, and it's very hard for people to grasp what happened, because I survived the civil war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And even for me personally, it's hard to tell a story, and it's even harder for people to understand what exactly happened. So I think it's very important that we educate younger generation here, what's going on. So to raise awareness and to take some action. I also did write some of the texts, and it's heartbreaking because these are human beings, individuals, and some of the families will never have closure because we have no idea who they are. So that's all I want to say. I mean, it's very, very important work. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Can I jump in and maybe prompt others to, can I show a couple of things and kind of in response to your question, but I'll preface it. And because one of the things that I think is interesting about Jason DeLeon's range of work, because he's, the book for which he received the MacArthur Genius Award is called Land of Open Graves. And so that has probably more kind of ethnographic, descriptive kind of, but it also has photos of that, which he himself describes as graphic photos, and the language that he uses, he kind of talks about the choices, the intentional kind of choices to be raw and direct. There's no euphemism kind of that he's going for, and he explains his struggle over the ethics of including a photo of a corpse, in varying states of decomposition. And then he's also done a different exhibition project called States of Exception, and I'll show images of these too, but which has material culture artifacts, so like backpacks and clothing and accessories and gear that was found in migrant layup sites. So that's a different kind of materiality, but you're not seeing faces, or you're not seeing kind of, so it's again, a kind of the presence absence play is happening there. And then you have hostile terrain, which is a kind of third form. And so I think that the question is excellent. And so I just wanted to show a couple of those images and then like kind of maybe encourage, I'd love to hear what other people think about these three kind of modes of representation, and what are the, how can it not be kind of sensationalized? And there are obviously philosophers who've thought about this too. I'm less qualified to speak about that. But so this is an image from the 2015 book, Land of Open Graves. And he talks about his choice to include voices and photos. He says, you know, you must hear their voices and see their faces to appreciate the violence and suffering, and that his interlocutors wanted this to be known. They wanted the realness of their situation to be, for him to represent that. So there is always a struggle in anthropology, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, about depicting suffering and what are the kind of ethical dilemmas for the scholar, because their career can bank on how they are they make a career out of this work in some ways. And so there's a real ambivalence about not speaking as if you are in the position of the people suffering, but drawing attention. So it's a kind of very delicate situation and balance. And he, I think, struggles with that. This is from States of Exception, which was the 2017 exhibition. This is the kind of backpack clothing gear. And then we kind of know the quilts, but also the kind of text, but also the toe tag itself is it's a sort of documentation that we're familiar with in a particular way. And so I think, yeah, I'm just curious. I thought about like Susan Sontag's work on war photography and some of the dangerous, or the assumption that people will be outraged and then take action, but it doesn't always kind of go that way. And but yeah, I'm happy to seed. And then should I stop sharing my screen, or if I can figure out how to do that? Sorry, hold on. Oh, it's not letting me. Sorry, folks. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that.
Really like your pictures, and I'll tell you why. Because again, during the war in Bosnia, there were so many photos from the war, and I never understood those pictures because I didn't feel that they presented Bosnian population. So if you look at any of those photos, you may think that you are somewhere, I'm not trying to be offensive, but somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere so far away, So you can't make connection that this is happening in the heart of Europe. And these people are people like everybody else. So it's very important, to get that message across. And I really love those pictures. I mean, they're very, very powerful. Speak thousands of words. So I don't know why people make these decisions. Does it mean that they can attract more aid, or maybe it will be more heartbreaking, for a viewer? But I found them extremely, extremely offensive.
So I think that is a good point to mention that this exhibition, although highlights the humanitarian crisis at the US-Mexico border, it does have a global dimension. And I think that's why it is so successful. And I think that's why it was very easy for Jason de Leon to find more than 150 partners around the world to really install this exhibition in many different settings. And I wanted to just very briefly discuss my experience that had prepared me, to participate in Hostile Terrain 94. And that was first, the crisis in Europe, the migration crisis in Europe, and especially with the Syrian conflict, all the people that have been displaced from Syria moved to Turkey, have crossed to Greece, have walked all the way to Europe and Germany and many other Western European countries. That was a crisis that started in 2015 and it's still ongoing. And we can think of the Mediterranean as the equivalent to the Sonoran Desert, because many people try to cross the Mediterranean, they don't make it. It happens between Turkey and Greece, it happens between Libya and Italy. So it happens also, people trying to cross to Spain. So it is a global crisis, and there have been some powerful images that have sort of characterized that crisis. One image was a young child that died, didn't make it, in the crossing in the Mediterranean, and it was a father just holding a still child. And that was a very powerful message. It brought a lot of sympathy for the migrants, but very soon, the policies went back to just excluding them. It didn't have a long-lasting impact. So these images of pain, of conflict, of, these kind of violence are really powerful. The question is whether you can harvest them and really bring change. So I think, we ought to also discuss that aspect.
So one of the things, so I guess I have one sort of point and then one question based on what Claire showed. But one of the things I really appreciate about the hostile terrain visualization and the toe tags on the quilt is that it's really simple, right? So it's undergirded by this immense logistical effort and by all this rich data that Effie talked about earlier. But the actual information is just a set of 5-10 facts, right? And so the facts themselves, there's no editorializing, there's no aggrandizing, it's just facts. But when they're put together, they actually speak volumes. And so I appreciate both how these little bits of data fit together and that it doesn't require either the creator or the viewer to impose a sort of newsworthy narrative. It sort of speaks for itself in that way. And I think in doing so, it meets sort of our ethical obligations as scholars. But Claire, your presentation and then Adam, your question had prompted me to think about, again, sort of the interdisciplinarity of our project here. And the way that my research community represents violence is through excruciating detail that is entirely sanitized, right? So maybe there's no editorializing. It's very, very detail oriented, all in text, but with no humanity. And so I think it's interesting to think about how different disciplines will grasp the same issue, whether that's mass migration or internally displaced people or mass violence, in very different ways. And I think that the ticket, to Effie's point about affecting change, is that there really needs to be a triangulation, right? One picture might not do it. It's sort of how do we triangulate these little bits of representation in order to make the work effective with both an A and an E for different groups of people. But Claire, I really love thinking about DeLeon's work across multiple ways, and then, okay, how does that fit how I would do it if I were writing from a political science or international legal perspective, which is very different.
This concept of representation, I think it is a very important ethical issue to work with in how we represent people and their stories. I remember in some research I was doing in graduate school about the Iraq War that followed the 9/11 attacks, and how the names of those who had died in the Twin Towers and the other sites were being used to support a particular political position. on something. I don't remember the specific context, but some of the survivors of these people that had died that day joined together. They were saying, not in my name, or not in my loved one's name. They felt that this loved one's name was being used to advocate for something that that person wouldn't have been in favor of. And so that was it was a really important thing for me to encounter early in my graduate research. To understand that as a scholar, I have a responsibility to not misrepresent people or appropriate their stories for my own agenda, whatever it may be. And so I think, as Courtney has said, Hostile Terrain does a good job here of taking this data and giving it back something personal, but not necessarily telling, not using that person's identity, those people's identity, for more than that. But other than to say, this is a real person, this is something that happened to them. And then to use that to make the viewer curious of what's the story, what happened.
As a follow-up, and this is really a question for those of you that have been following Jason DeLeon's work more closely than I, has there been feedback about the Hostile Terrain exhibit from survivors of the deceased whose identification materials are up on the exhibit? What have families said? This is just an empirical question. Do you know?
I don't know offhand, but I do know that in other aspects of his work that he has tried to, kind of capture a holistic picture of the story. And so finding family members, back in Central America, or following like longitudinally different individual crossers' stories. Now, this aren't necessarily the ones represented in the exhibition, but rather people who he would, be doing field work in Nogales or around that area. And there would be people who go and return, multiple times. And so speaking with them on a daily or, multiple times. So you get the long term and then the breadth in terms of trying to connect with families and individuals. But I'm not sure about the specific reception of this version of kind of his work.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'm still thinking about that question, ethics of representing, especially now when we have so much social media and people share images of, police brutality, and there's a question, should we be sharing those images? Should we be, what's the proper context to put that in? And I agree. I think Hostile Terrain does a great job of doing it in a way that's respectful and also pushes you to consider, your own role in what's going on, but also, well, now what can I do now that I have even more of a connection? It almost ties you to it in a way that won't let go, I found, after I started even trying to help in the project. So that got me also wondering, I don't know a lot about this history, but I do know that participatory projects like these have played a role in sort of a struggle for human rights, or more broadly against domination and oppression. I'm just wondering if you could say more about that. What other projects, or does this have a tie? We clearly, there are more things tied to this particular project, but I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
I have some things related to quilt making in particular that I can share, but I certainly also want to hear other sorts of projects, maybe that are not textile related, I'll share my screen here with you. Linda Pershing, who has written a book called The Ribbon Around the Pentagon, Piece by Peacemakers. In that book, she says, in circumstances in which women's perceptions may be stifled, trivialized, or ignored, the fabric arts, which have come to be associated so closely with domesticity and female practice, have provided women a means of conveying their allegiances and critiques of societies in which they have lived. That's sort of just an overview of in quilt making as one of those needle arts has been used for since at least the early 1800s for women to be involved in social issues. Abolition is one of them. This is an image of a quilt. It's a crib quilt, possibly made by Lydia Maria Child, who was an abolitionist. And in the center is a poem, a prayer for women to think of the Negro woman who's, and this is I'm quoting, think of the Negro mother when her child is torn away, sold for a little slave, oh then for that mother pray. Other quilts represent abolition sentiments. This is a quilt in the International Quilt Museum collection, made within a Quaker community, which was known for its abolitionism. Temperance was also one of the, and I should just turn on the slideshow here, that'll make it easier. Yes, temperance, which I don't have an image to represent. Suffrage was also an issue where needlework was used by a collection of women. But to come up more up to date, in issues of peace in the time of nuclear threat, a group, the National Peace Quilt, was made by the Boise Peace Quilt Project. It includes drawings by children from all 50 states, and this project invited all the senators in the US to spend a night sleeping under it, and then to write the reflections in an accompanying journal. And they asked them to rest under it, to dream of a different world, and then to take action. One of the largest potentially, and the most well-known is the Names Project, which it's a memorial quilt, but it also had a social and human rights agenda to raise attention to the epidemic, to get government action towards research, to find a cure for the disease, and other outcomes that were desired as well. Another quilt in the International Quilt Museum collection that commemorates the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations. People have used quilts to tell their own stories. This is by Hmong people who were displaced and in Laos, and it depicts some the violence that was done against them as a way to use their needle as a way of agency to tell their story to others. This also relates to migration. This is a quilt from the Migrant Quilt Project that was in an exhibition at the International Quilt Museum last year, using the same data actually that the Hostel Terrain 94 uses, but depicting it by year of death. And then this particular artist has represented, to use a term we've talked about earlier, represented these deaths in a very particular way with these skulls and including the cause of death in more of a graphic and pictorial way. But this is a group project that has made a quilt for each year since 2000. We had that exhibition there, and we included some clothing from the desert that was discovered in the Sonoran Desert. And that clothing, all of these quilts include clothing that was discarded by migrants as they passed through the desert. Civil rights, this is an individual artist who is depicting things that have happened in the South during the civil rights movement. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the water cannon used against protesters, the segregation of water fountains, etc. Also, an artist who, as quilts have become more accepted as a form of art, has used the quilt as a way to look at the racial history and legacies by depicting a slave ship and how Blacks from Africa were housed as basically cargo, and they're across the Atlantic. And then much more recently, a Black Lives Matter quilt that was part of an exhibition addressing the racial and civil rights issues, including things like "I can't breathe" and other statements that call attention to this. So either they're group-made individual quilts or larger projects that used multiple quilts to communicate on these topics. So I'm sorry that was long, but I wanted to give some context for why Hostel Train 94 at Nebraska is a quilt. It's drawing upon these meanings and these ways in which quilts have been used.
I really like, I mean, of course I like those examples, Jonathan.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that strikes me, this question about kind of participation or mobilization in different ways, and the fact of having a kind of tangible outcome or something that persists, you know, beyond an ephemeral coming together, which can also be really powerful. But I'm just thinking about, it's interesting to consider contrasts with things that like go viral on social media, or the ways that there were discussions about how Twitter, you know, prompted the Arab Spring or the so-called Arab Spring, or how those ways of mobilizing do or do not translate into people actually coming together. I mean, clearly in the instances that you share, Jonathan, people did come together. That's what we're looking at, the materialization of those acts. But it's also interesting to think about, you know, the kind of, for example, the George Floyd, you know, videos, or those kinds of videos, and then the kind of movement through social media, and then moving out into the streets and the sustained mobilization. So all of those forms are kind of operate in different ways.
So on that note, your question, Adam, prompted me to think about some examples of different modes of participation. And so I have 3 examples from Latin America. And I think it's important to stress that the quilts too, right, are not just an American phenomenon. And so the first example that I thought of when you posed the question were the apilleras from Chile. So when Chilean women were trying to express their resistance to the Pinochet regime, but mobilizing in the street was sort of cut off from them because the regime had become so hostile. They took to quilting, and they produced these resistance quilts, and really documented in quite vivid detail the repression of the regime, right? So that's one way, and particularly a way for women to participate in a political process that was largely dominated by men, right? But a very, very active and very effective one. The next mode, so we'll tour around the southern cone here. The next mode would be the Madres of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, who started off as a group of moms and grandmothers who march, and they continue to march, and now are organized officially. I don't know why I put quotes. They are officially an organization, but when they started, they were just a group of mothers and grandmothers who would wear a placard with their child or grandchild, like the missing child or grandchild, around their neck and a white kerchief on their head. And they would go every single Tuesday and they would march in front of the presidential palace, and they still do. And that was a very participatory movement. It was meant to get information about their kids, not take down the regime, although they were very instrumental in doing so. And the documentation for that, the physical sort of remains of that movement live on today in their continued marching, but it's also quite literally etched on the square right in front of the presidential palace. You can see where they have been and where they are.
Mm.
And then if we move over one more, in Brazil during the dictatorship, there was a group called Nunca Mais, so never again. And all they did was photocopy documents. That's all they did, because before the internet, before everything was digitized, if you were an authoritarian regime and you wanted to get rid of, the evidence of your dirty hands, you just burned it. It was quite straightforward. And so they worked 24 hours a day. They had a couple offices in Rio, Sao Paulo, and just photocopied documents that they would mail abroad. Right? But it was very much a participatory effort to document what the military regime was doing, just to get the information out there. So there's lots of examples of these participatory processes.
I just want to say that the Hostile Terrain 94 does have a political dimension. It's clear that the time frame before the pandemic hit was to coincide with the US elections, in August, September, October. And to us, that was important. And that's why we really, made the decision to go ahead, even though, we're in the midst of the pandemic. So the expectation is that you will turn this new consciousness, new knowledge about what is going on to political action. So I think that is a significant element of Hostile Terrain 94, and we shouldn't, just leave it out. It's part of the package, in my view.
Yeah, that's excellent. I just wanted to make sure that someone had asked a question. I think there is some relation to what we've been talking about in this question. The question is on the chat, so you can pull it up to see it, but it says, how do we as viewers and organizers return agency and self-definition to the many anonymous immigrants who have passed away and are represented in Hostile Terrain 94? One thought I had in thinking about the ethics of representing it, until I'd seen this question, I hadn't really thought about, well, how do we empower the people who have been lost through doing a project like this? Does it help that? Does it, just what are your thoughts about that?
Adam, I really appreciate you naming my question. And specifically, I'm a grad student. I'm in the English department here at UNL. And so somebody brought this up earlier, but that it seems like one of the values in this, this exhibit is that here's something that's global, that's very data heavy. At the same time, through the act of writing the name tags, it becomes very personal. And yet, like somebody already mentioned, we're talking about the death of many people who are unknown and whose stories we will never know. And I know something that's really kind of central to my discipline in English is that kind of this idea of choosing how your life and how your desires will be used. And yet, like we've already been talking, there is a political element to this exhibit. It is participatory, it is international. And yet at the same time, here's in many ways the end in what could be seen as some very terrible conditions. And yet these moments are becoming part of this exhibit.
Yeah.
Just reflect one
please.
thing from the scholars panel that was held on the first day that the exhibition opened in September. Something that was new to me is that a person's identity is one of their basic rights, the human right. And by giving these data points names, I think is acknowledging an individual identity. And maybe that is a sense of agency for someone who has already passed away.
Yeah, I'm also kind of jumping off from that. So obviously the individuals who perished and are represented, whether that's with a named, tag or an unnamed tag. I mean, there are organizations that are trying to connect, to serve almost as intermediaries between like the medical examiner's office and families back in, places of origin or homes, basically. So one way potentially that what we could do, it won't help, like I said, it won't help people who've already perished, but it might, by supporting those, most of them are kind of nonprofit or humanitarian organizations, and there are many, supporting those organizations, but also I think, like you pointed out, that not reducing a life to this moment, that this isn't the only, this was a whole person who had many other, who had family, who had loved ones. So we have to be careful not to just sort of mark this moment, but seek to find out more information about what else, and ask these curious questions, or seeking more information about conditions for other people, perhaps, if we don't know the individuals who are unidentified, but trying to get more, have more connections with those fuller stories, I think is important.
I also think this question actually speaks to sort of the legal insecurities of migrants. So there's pretty defined international law around refugees, and there's fairly refined, and I don't necessarily, by refined I don't necessarily mean good, but solid law around refugee rights and around immigration. There is not solid law around migrants, right? So they fall into this legal gap. And I think that those who have been identified, but those who have not been identified rather, really represent to some degree this lacuna between these two different bodies of law and these two different states, governments, where they have no identity. And when they're in this transitional moment, they have very few rights according to international law. So actually, I think having these bodies be unidentified speaks volumes, not just about the humanitarian crisis, but also about a real legal gap, both at the domestic and international level, because we have no recourse to know who these individuals are. And in many ways, they have no rights either.
I just wanted to think about the original goals of Hostile Terrain 94, and we have discussed them. We, discussed that awareness of the human toll extracted by the current policies is one of the goals, to raise awareness. And the other is to memorialize the dead. And I think that has become really effective with the exhibition being installed in 150 different locations. So think that each life that is represented by a toe tag will be considered 150 times by volunteers as their details are handprinted. And that's powerful. That's powerful. And then another of the goals was to amplify local programming to be reflective of local immigration issues. And maybe here we are at that moment where we can think, what is the next step, right? We did what we did to bring this exhibition in Nebraska. We have really tried to adapt it to, our state and our expertise, including this itinerant quilt, which is amazing. But what would be the next step, right? How can we keep the conversation going? So to me, it's a question that I'd like to pose, not just to our panelists, but, to every participant.
Yeah, I'd like to ask, project like this has great impact. It's very powerful for those who are sensitive to the kind of needs, the human rights, these kinds of things. Is there any research to indicate what impact projects like this have on those who are antagonistic, oppositional to these causes behind that? Because again, I'm looking to seek to try to bring people together rather than to tear them apart. What can we do that impacts that we can help everyone?
So this doesn't precisely answer your question, but it's related. So the research on public opinion and at least US human rights foreign policy is pretty depressing, actually, if you're wanting to affect change in US foreign policy. But really what the research suggests is that what we call the Oprah Winfrey effect. So when someone goes on a talk show, or now in sort of a more modern era, you have sort of these viral memes. Effie mentioned the very moving picture about the father holding his son. They do, in fact, improve public opinion on the aggregate toward more humane foreign policies. And then foreign policy makers, i.e. our legislators, promptly disregard it because there's an assumption that the public doesn't know about or care enough about foreign policy to hold legislators accountable for it. So public opinion is movable. I don't know that there's too much about how these sorts of projects and just in general issue framing antagonizes opposition, but the sort of depressing news is that politicians don't believe the moves in public opinion in the first place, or don't care enough about them.
Not surprising. Thank you.
It's a really great question. And I think back to Adam's frustration around academia and like how we can, make impressions on people that last for a longer time. And I kind of tie that into this question because it's like, how do we reach those that really need to be reached, right? The legislators, the decision makers. Anyways, it's a great question. I don't have an answer, but I just wanted to echo. I appreciate it very much.
I do think one of the ways that, the idea behind this project that's trying to find some common ground is in the human, like we're all humans. We can all, in looking at these tags, at least there's a hypothetical kind of thinking process that happens where you try to imagine yourself in that position. Or a lot of comments in the tag sessions were people who had completed a tag for a person that they felt, was similar in age, or that they had a relative that could have been. And so there are all these kind of could have been me thinking. And I think that is one way to try to connect with people who might at least initially be antagonistic. But how do you get those people kind of through the door is a challenge, I think.
I was gonna say too, I don't know much about research, but anecdotally, like I have experience in high school and adult education classrooms. So like I've seen just on small scales, like how maybe not this specific project, but similar types of things can make big impacts on students and the general population. So I think that like that kind of exposure goes a long way in swaying public opinion, even if it doesn't necessarily transcend to where it needs to go.
I also think there's a question of not everybody has to believe, right? It's just the right people have to believe. And so I think that the point is, right, get it into classrooms, get it to college students who are really open across the political spectrum. We're really open to the sort of humanitarian side of this exhibit, right? So it's finding the right avenues rather than trying to get everyone on board, because that's not going to happen, right? You just have to get it to the right people and at the right time. I think that's important too. I don't have answers for when and how, but I think that's.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and lots of them happening so that you happen to run into someone who, oh, I participated in something too. And you get an actual conversation instead of just met with a blank stare, like, oh, what was that like? Like, oh, well, you should go do it. Yeah, great. We're actually a little over time, but any parting thoughts since this is the last event for this installation? I just wanted to open up the floor to the panel for any final thoughts to leave us with.
I would just say thank you for participating, for sending your students, for being here today. I think maybe Effie, you referenced this before. We had so many different groups of UNL community members and Lincoln community members participate. It was actually really exciting and inspiring. So thanks to all of you for being part of this.
I also add my thanks for all of you being here and all of you who were participated in one way in creating this exhibition. We couldn't have done it without all of the help.
Same. I want to thank everybody. It has been a wonderful experience. 2020 has been a very difficult year for all of us. And believe it or not, this was one of the bright spots, to just talk about this very dark issue and really make a large part of our community involved in the process. And I think 2020 was a momentous year. We are going to see its effects in the coming years. And in a way, all the social unrest and awareness about police brutality, all of that came together, in the past few months. And I think brutality is also the violence at the border. So it is part of the same package that we need to find ways to really create a momentum for social justice and turn this into something that will not kill another 3,000 or 8,000 people in the next 20 years.
Yeah, just your comment there at the very end mimics or echoes something another person said during one of the sessions, the toe tag sessions, was that we don't want to be filling these tags out again 10 years down the road. So, let's figure out how to avoid that scenario. And I will also just add that this goes to Omaha. So it's not technically over. And so it goes to Omaha November 5th. It opens at Amplify Arts Gallery. And there will be a couple of Zoom events that will happen during the duration of the run there. So that's like November 5th to the 28th. So we'll continue to circulate, ways to connect with folks mostly associated with the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies at UNO. So it continues.
And just the exhibition is open currently at the International Quilt Museum through Saturday, tomorrow.
Well, great. Please thank I'd say clap, but it probably won't work. Please thank our panelists. I can't thank you enough. It's been a great session and a really heavy topic, but really necessary. And I can't thank you enough for bringing it here. It's really cool.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye. Oh, and I'll send this recording. So.